My dad almost sacrificed himself for me. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents but decided to move to a different, and much larger, city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult. To come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited, though sad to leave all my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss the few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave, when you're coming back. Even if it's 2 a.m. Oh, and you'll have to park on the street because the apartment complex has limited parking. One more thing. There's the neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known to all the women in the complex as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge, very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason, my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking other women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man make a show of being in their place. A brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what he was to the woman or what he looked like. George would back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who is also quite tall and rather big, intimidating, I felt also confident that I would be alright. And I was. For a time. It started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more until she got up and left him. One night I was sitting on my porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say that I felt like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette. Shakily, I stubbed it out and went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all my doors and then played a video game in my room. I told myself that I was probably just paranoid. The next morning I got up for my morning cigarette and coffee. Lo and behold, minutes after I got onto my porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep a head out of his door. Of course, the other women in the complex have already tried to call police about George. But he lives in the complex and staring isn't a crime, so there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with other women before. With that info in my mind, I knew calling wouldn't be much use. things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to her parking spot. So I had 3 ways to get from my car to my apartment depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of the paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass, behind the tree. It was like he thought I couldn't see him. Picture a child hiding very terribly behind the tree. You can see 90% of their body and you know that they are there. That's how he would do it. I would rush past him, avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him come after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never been in any kind of fight in my life. Around this time I believe my mom was trying to find me free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything on my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George edged closer and closer to escalating as the days went by. It went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 for me if need be. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get in silently, lol. I started sitting on the floor of my porch below the wall out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. Nightmares of being kidnapped or raped or murdered started to invade my sleep every night. Then one day my neighbor, Shell, was gossiping to me. "Did you hear about George?" "No." "He got arrested last night. In the complex parking lot there's a big sort of electrical power box. It stands about waist height, and is perhaps 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home, and park right in front of it, some lady with her kid walking by and saw George sitting on the box masturbating. Was he waiting there for me? Jerking off to the thought of me seeing him? Ugh, the thought makes me want to puke and scares me all at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress. But it was only a few days that he was gone. Then he was back, and he went right back to the same routine. One night he got far braver. It was maybe 7 p.m. when I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "Dude's asking to get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted to the neighbor some more. I rolled my eyes, went inside, and played some more video games. I was healing in the World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting, "Where are you?" But I was healing, a pretty important job, and I figured she was talking to someone else. until she burst into my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot frantically like she was doing the potty dance. "He's bleeding." "Who?" I asked in bewilderment. "Your dad. Come quick." I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed our little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid like tossing up his pocket knife and trying to catch it. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with a real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell, and my neighbor Caleb held a shirt to my dad's side. He was facing away from me, and his entire back was just covered in blood. It looked like he had been mauled by a bear. That was seriously my first thought. I didn't know we had bears in this city. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood sprayed. I feel queasy writing this down. I have never in my life been the person people turn to in an emergency. Blood makes me lightheaded and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all of the adults, people around 30-40, while I was just 18, around me were panicked aside from Caleb. I needed to be the person that people turned to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told Shell where we keep our towels. She rushed to go grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like they'd never heard of 911 before. "No," my dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up," I said. "What happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." So I dialed 911, and relayed our address and reason for emergency. Operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was just one big puddle of blood, gross, he stayed on his feet until someone thought to run and get him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them the house that George lived in. And then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly and I wanted to scream at them to run. My dad could be bleeding out. Don't you care? I learned later that they don't run because if they let adrenaline kick in, mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and got him packed into the ambulance. I was about to jump on when police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so I could give my statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. God, 2 years later and all these details have been burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2-3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad. Once I had called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmom's message, That's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried for forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was very nice. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, and there were 14 cop cars. 14. He still kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back and felt such hatred that I have never in my life felt. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw that George was staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back to my house where I waited for information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George had shouted back at him while I was in the house, totally unaware. George said something along the lines of "Come tell me that" to my face like a man. So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand, and then got my dad in the back with the knife. It missed his kidney very narrowly, traveled up and punctured his lung and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time in the upper back. This wound was much more shallow but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. I still have pictures in my email of it, as well as my dad's injuries. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail. I feel like it was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about it all, like my dad had to fight my own battle for me. Throughout the week while I was on my porch or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They had all been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain he would be away for good. Several poor women had had George stalk them up to their apartment door and pull his pants down, demanding sex. I can't believe the cops couldn't do anything. One of those days, one of my neighbors came up to me to tell me that the police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place, buried in gardens, stuck behind trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think that he might have plans to one day grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever, but my dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned to fight the way my dad can, but I am still a pussy who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad is doing alright now. He's just had his third surgery on Tuesday trying to repair the damage done to him internally. We're hoping that this will be his last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't fought George for me, maybe I would have been the first victim George stabbed. I apologize for any spelling or grammatical mistakes. I reread it over once to check, but I'm not perfect. George, let's not meet again. I almost let my sister's stalker into my house. This happened a few days ago and I'm still pretty shaken about it. I only just thought to post it here, so here goes. On Friday afternoon I got a call from my friend named Sarah asking if I wanted to meet her and another friend named Lisa at Dunkin' Donuts as we hadn't seen one another in a while. Dunkin' Donuts is a 15-minute walk from my house, so I decided I would walk. Besides, the weather was fine. I got to Dunkin' Donuts and found where Sarah and Lisa were sat, so I went to join them. As we were chatting, I noticed that my sister, Elena, was sat at a table in the corner of the room with her friend, Jess. For some context, my sister and her friend are both 18 years old. My sister still lives with my parents, whereas I live alone. I excused myself from the table and went over to Elena and Jess' table. They were sat at a table with 3 seats, so I went to sit down and said hey. They both jumped a little bit but then looked more relieved than anything to see me. Immediately Elena whispered to me, "Don't look now." But the guy in the blue shirt, I think he's been following Jess and I glanced over and I saw the middle-aged man sat at a table facing away from us. He's passed our table a good 5 times in the past 20 minutes to go to the bathroom, but he walks slower as he passes us, she continued. I told them that they were most likely being paranoid and that there was nothing to worry about. But for their peace of mind I offered to leave with them so they wouldn't feel as worried. I walked back over to my table and explained the situation to Sarah and Lisa. Both of them laughed it off and assumed my sister to be paranoid. Literally about a minute later I saw the man get up from his seat and walk towards the bathroom. My eyes followed him and sure enough he walked extremely slow past Elena and Jess. In fact, it was almost comical how obviously slow he became. Both Elena and Jess looked in my direction and I nodded to show that I had seen him walk slower. About 5 minutes later I went into the toilets. On my way I passed Elena and Jess and told them I was ready to leave whenever they were. They both agreed that they were ready to leave now. I told them that I was just going to the bathroom and that we could leave after I had done my business. Elena had come in her car, so she was going to give me a lift back. I went into the toilet stall, did said business, washed my hands. I was walking down the corridor back into the main eating area when Elena and Jess rushed into the corridor. I asked them what's up and they explained that another man had joined this strange creeper man and that the men were both pointing and staring at them, so they rightfully felt unsafe. We walked back into the eating area. I put my money on our table and explained to Lisa and Sarah that I was taking off and I would explain what was going on when I got home. We all got into Elena's car and left the creeps in the car's rearview mirror. After a 2-minute drive we reached my house. Just then I had remembered that I had been meaning to return something I had borrowed from my mother, so I asked if Elena could drive me to my parents' house as she was going there anyway. I jumped out the car to get what I needed when my phone rang. It was Elena. She explained that the car had driven past and had pulled into a driveway. She said the driver of the vehicle was the creep from Dunkin' Donuts. I looked out of my window and sure enough there was a car which didn't belong to the owner of the house parked on their driveway. I got the girls into my house and locked the door. I instructed Elena to take a photo of the car and its license plate, and I told Jess to call 911 as she'd give the operator more information than what I could. Elena took the photos and we sort of gathered around Jess as she was speaking to the operator. She had finished telling the story and I heard the operator assure us that the police would be at my house soon. A few minutes passed and there was a loud knock at the front door followed by a loud voice shouting, "It's the police." We all did a sigh of relief as I went to open the door. Jess told the operator that the police were here and she hung up. I was in the process of unlocking the door when I thought to look through the spy hole at the top of the door. I peered through and it wasn't a police officer, it was the same guy. I froze in fear and I didn't know what to say. "We didn't call the police," I managed to shout back to the man through the door. Elena and Jess were both confused as to why I said this. "We had a call, sir." The man shouted back, "You have the wrong address." I yelled back and informed the girls that it was the creep at the door and not a police officer. Both were rightfully shocked and extremely scared, as was I. I was about to tell Jess to call the police again until I heard the sirens. "Sir, you have to let me in," the man shouted again. This time I didn't answer. He was pounding on the door. His commands for me to let him in turned into begging and pleading. I heard the police car pull up and some commotion outside. An actual police officer knocked on the door and I let him in. Yes, I checked the spy hole first. The police officers took the man into custody while another police officer took Elena and Jess into the dining room for some brief questioning. I called my parents and Jess called hers. Both were here extremely quickly once we told them what had happened. The man was found with a kitchen knife on his person and some other weapons in his car. Who knows what could have happened if I hadn't looked through the spy hole first. Both my sister and her friend are fine. just shaken up after the whole incident. So, guy who stalked my sister and her friend, let's not meet. Guy staring through my window. This one happened when I was probably 4 or 5 years old. We live in a tiny town in North Carolina. Combined with the city and entire county, we have a roughly 5,000 person population. Now, when I used to live with my parents before I married, we lived 10 minutes from town. Our neighbors are family and they live about an acre away in each direction. We know everyone and everyone knows us. When I was young, I had a particular fear of leaving my curtains up at night. I had to have my windows covered before I could sleep. I was too young to verbalize it at the time, but the concept of waking up with someone looking through my windows terrified me. After this incident, this particular fear of mine has amplified. Anyways, to get to the actual story, we lived pretty much by ourselves. If anyone comes onto our property, we know who they are. So, when my father and older brother started finding boot prints that didn't belong to them, we got a little nervous. Living out as far as we did meant that police, fire department, or EMS would take much longer in a bad situation. My father had taught my older brother, sister, and me how to handle guns, even from an early age. At 6, I was fairly proficient with my Daisy BB gun. So, over the course of several days, they started to notice more boot tracks. Stuff was being moved around in the bar. The building door was open one morning, though we couldn't tell if anything was missing or not. It was apparent that someone was snooping around at night. Since I was so young, my parents didn't want to frighten me, but my brother did. He told me that someone was creeping around the yard at night, and one day I would wake up and he'd be in the house. To put it lightly, my brother was an asshole. My brother always made fun of the fact that I would not sleep with my windows uncovered. He told me I needed to face my fears, and eventually, during this time that someone was definitely sneaking around, he convinced me to sleep with my curtains drawn back. I craved his approval more than anything, so I agreed to do so. He said now was the best time to do it, and I believed him. So, that night, I left my curtains drawn. It took a long time for me to get to sleep, but eventually it did come. I was always a very light sleeper, and even the slightest gust of wind would wake me. I would always wake up 4 or 5 times a night. That night I heard the porch just outside my window creaking. I tried to ignore it, thinking that it had to be my imagination. Then a shadow passed over the light coming from the lamp outside. I opened my eyes and sat up. A man was standing in the window, hands cupped up to the glass. In the process of running out of my room, I did piss myself. I ran straight for my parents' bedroom. At the same time, the doorknob to the front door started jiggling hard. He was trying to get in. I managed to get into the bedroom and tell my parents what had happened. My dad grabbed a gun and flashlight and headed outside, throwing the door open. Mom locked it behind him before waking up my brother. After nearly half an hour, my father came back in. His face was sweaty and pale. He sent my brother and I to bed, but we both sat up and listened. My father had found a tarp and blankets set up about half a mile into the woods, just off a logging trail that had been dug in some 20 years previously. Guy had been there a while. Dad apparently tore the place apart. He had sight of the guy but lost him in the end. The police came and took statements from my parents and had a look in the woods, but didn't find anything. They figured he wouldn't be back anytime soon. We never saw him again, and I always sleep with my windows covered. So, creepy-ass man spying on a 4-year-old. Let's not meet.